Welcome to another episode of the Primal Edge Health Podcast. I'm Tristan, and we've got a special guest for you today, Dr. Stephanie Seneff. Now, Dr. Seneff is a senior research scientist at the MIT Computer Sciences and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. And we're not here to talk about computer sciences and artificial intelligence. We're here to talk about something else that she's highly passionate about, and that is the widespread use of a very dangerous chemical called glyphosate. Now, glyphosate is the key component of RoundUp. Now, RoundUp, as many of you already know, is one of the most widely used pesticide, herbicide, and insecticides in the world. It is sprayed heavily on many crops, and Dr. Seneff has been studying this for several years now and has compiled some very interesting research on the subject. Now, I've talked before about why I believe it's very important to focus on high quality foods. And this podcast is really going to flesh out a lot of the deep reasons why it's important to focus on food quality, why organic foods are preferable, and why organic cultivation methods that preserve the microbiome of the soil, which will also preserve the microbiome in your body, in your gut, why this is so important to the future of humanity, to the future of this planet, and why it's relevant to the current state of our health. We're going to hit on some deep stuff here. It's a fascinating podcast. I really appreciate Dr. Seneff coming on. Dr. Stephanie Seneff got her Bachelor's of Science at MIT in Biophysics in 1968. She then received her Master's degree in Electrical Engineering and her PhD in Computer Science. So she doesn't really have a dog in the fight here. She's not dependent on research grants from food companies. She's not, her job, her life, her source of income does not depend on her stance on this subject. So I think it's very important that people realize she doesn't have a dog in the fight. She is an outsider of sorts, but has an extensive background in the analysis of scientific research. She is a scientific researcher herself and is very well versed in the modern scientific method. So if you like it, share it with your friends. You can find more at www.primaledgehealth.com. Enjoy. We're going to talk about something that is, to some people, very controversial, and to much of my audience, very kind of old news. And that's the dangers of glyphosate, the effects of one of the most potent and widely used components of modern chemical-based agriculture. How did you get into glyphosate? How did you get into this research? And maybe after that we can touch a little bit on the history of glyphosate, where it came from, and what it is.
Right. So I was, about 9 years ago, I was concerned about the rising autism rates. I was seeing exponential growth in autism in the United States, and I knew that exponential growth is really scary. So I wanted to try to understand what might be causing that epidemic. And I figured it had to be something in the environment, some kind of toxic chemical these kids were being exposed to. So I was looking for things that were also rising exponentially that could potentially be correlated. And actually, I looked for 5 years before I discovered glyphosate because I believed, like everybody else, that Roundup is relatively harmless. You know, the fact that you can go down to the hardware store and buy it and put it on the weeds in your yard leads you to believe that it's not very toxic. And everything you've been told about it is that it's not very toxic for humans. That's the wonderful thing about it as an herbicide. And so it didn't occur to me that glyphosate might be the cause of the autism epidemic until 4 years ago, when I serendipitously heard a talk by Professor Don Huber he's a retired professor from Purdue University, an expert on plant pathology. And he had become aware of glyphosate's toxicity many years before. So he had become very active. Once he retired, he was very active in promoting this concept that glyphosate is much more toxic than we realize. And he talked about the specific specific effects of glyphosate on human physiology. And they matched extremely well with my list of known pathologies associated with autism. So I really woke up. When I listened to his talk, I was like, oh my God, this must be it kind of reaction, you know. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't even heard the word glyphosate before that. So it was pretty amazing. And then I just dropped everything else and started really digging deep into glyphosate from that point forward.
So glyphosate, what exactly is glyphosate and why is it used? Who manufactures it, and how long has this been, how long have they been spraying this on crops such as wheat and soy?
Okay, good. So glyphosate is the active ingredient in the pervasive herbicide RoundUp, which is the most common herbicide worldwide. And the United States loves Roundup. We use much more of it than any other country. We have 25% of the world's Roundup is sold in the United States, with 5% of the world's population. So you can see that in the United States, we suffer from a lot more. The use of glyphosate has gone up dramatically over the past 10, 20 years. And that's been in step with the introduction of the GMO Roundup Ready crop. So glyphosate was first introduced on the market actually in 1975. So it goes back several decades. But they didn't use much of it until around the late 1990s, after they figured out that they could insert a bacterial gene into a plant to make it resistant to glyphosate so that they could spray it all over the crop and the crop wouldn't die. That was a huge
glyphosate is actually a broad spectrum killer of all plants.
Yes, it kills all plants,
okay,
except for those that have this special bacterial gene that was inserted by this wonderful GMO technology that allows you to then be able to grow your crop without worrying about the fact that you're poisoning it. You spill all this poison over your crop, and the crop doesn't die. So,
but this is touted as something that's going to save the world. I mean, you have Bill Gates pushing very hard, spending a lot of money to get this into Africa. Bill Gates, mind you, who is also a huge proponent of population control and of decreasing the human population worldwide, which I think those kind of seem like diametrically opposed, kind of a cognitive dissonance situation going on there.
It is when you say feeding the world, right? Making sure there's plenty of food, but then at the same time hoping the population is going to go down. That seems very inconsistent.
It doesn't make very much sense. These are very interesting topics, and I think it's very important that people think rationally without emotional attachment, and maybe kind of recognize some of the programs that we might have, such as, well, GMO crops are beneficial because they increase crop yields. Now, this has recently been disproven. They do not increase crop yields long term.
No, that's right.
Yeah. So, all right. So,
because they destroy the soil. So the glyphosate really messes up the soil. Year after year, you get less and less organic matter. More and more microbes are dying. So the soil gets, just like it messes up the gut microbes, it disrupts the soil microbes. And it interferes with the fixation of nitrogen and carbon into the soil, which of course is going to increase the release of nitrogen and carbon oxides as contributing to global warming. So the climate change issues also, I think glyphosate's a major contributor. I suspect a much bigger contributor than we realize.
Wow, so there is a big concern now. I mean, the term climate change, it's been highly politicized, and I think it turns a lot of people off now because any of these issues, people tend to divide it. You have right and left, and if you believe that man-made climate change, then you're a nice, happy hippie who wants the world to be saved, and if you don't, then you're a fundamentalist jerk who thinks we should kill all Muslims. I mean, there's weird dichotomies
we have
here.
Incredible polarization right now, which I find very frustrating. Certain topics that you almost can't bring up because you're not sure how that person's going to feel about it and whether they're going to blow up at you because you have a certain position.
Absolutely.
It's really strange.
Absolutely. I mean, when you talk about, all right, here's one of the reasons why I think Dr. Seneff's message is so important and why her approach is that we should take note of her approach and the language that she uses. She's not an anti-GMO activist. She is a scientist who has studied and researched glyphosate very extensively. She is not monetarily invested in either side of this issue. Am I correct, Dr. Seneff? You're not receiving funding from the evil organic lobby. That
right, I know they like to say that they're just trying to push organic food, which I find really funny. You
mean the food that we ate for 20,000 years?
I know.
200,000. It's insane. So the polarization of this issue is fascinating. I think it's very counterproductive for anybody trying to get things done, to get some sane legislation through concerning glyphosate. The amount of glyphosate in Roundup allowed in crops and allowed in the final products of food seems to be increasing yearly. Am I right?
Yes, they keep raising the limits. I mean, what they do is periodically they test the food and then they say, oh my gosh, it's over the limit, so we better raise the limit. So they're not concerned with the safety per se, it seems to me. They're just like making sure, as long as the government says that this much can be in it, then the industry isn't liable, right, for having that much in there. As long as how much is in there is under the amount that is supposed to be the upper limit, you're okay. Right. That's the way the game works. So you just raise the limit, and you don't even do any toxicology tests to find out if that new limit is okay. Actually, I think no amount is okay. No glyphosate level is safe. It accumulates, and this is the thing that we're realizing in our studies, is that a certain percentage of the glyphosate that you consume ends up in your tissues in ways that are very, very difficult to get it out. And so you will get more and more over time as you age. And then eventually you get enough of it and get over a tipping point where you start to get some really nasty diseases.
Now, this is the issue which I think is fascinating. Oh, and I don't think I finished my thought on, she's not an anti-GMO activist, because I have no problem with people who are fundamentally against genetically modified organisms. I have no problem with the anti-GMO lobby, which is not really a lobby. There's not a lot of people putting money in it. These are individual private citizens who are concerned about the health, their own health and longevity, the health of their children, the rise in autism rates, and the changes that we're implementing, the biodiversity of the planet, not just the foods, monocropping corn, soy, wheat, tobacco, these GMO ready crops, these glyphosate ready crops, but what Stephanie focuses on is the effects of this specific compound, RoundUp, that is in RoundUp, glyphosate, and the provable, demonstrable damage that it can do to biology.
Right.
So we're not focused on like a religious, I don't want GMOs because it creeps me out. I don't like Soylent Green, and I read a few books and made me freaked out by technology. This is not what it's about. Stephanie Seneff in her job, actually, she works in artificial intelligence.
Right.
So
it's a computer science and artificial intelligence laboratory.
Yeah, so she's not fundamentally opposed to computers or technology. She's done research into this compound that is destroying that's destroying the health of many people and destroying the health of the soil biome. So I just want to get that across, that GMOs, it's a very easy straw man to say, well, I'm anti-GMO. It's very hard to prove that GMOs themselves are bad by looking at the research. But if you look at the research on glyphosate, it becomes very, very obvious when you dig into it that this stuff is not good for human health and for the health of the planet.
That's right. And in fact, I'm disappointed with the anti-GMO folks that they seem to miss the boat, because I think the really key thing about the GMOs is that they enable the increased use of glyphosate. And so they're causing the glyphosate problem because of that resistance. Yeah. And so that's why we have so much more glyphosate in our food. So they really should look at the chemicals. Of course, there's GMOs that also produce a toxin, the Bt toxin. And those are actually the two dominant GMOs, the glyphosate resistance and the Bt toxin. Yeah, they make up a huge percentage of the GMOs that are out there.
And the Bt corn, this Bt corn, doesn't this have genes that actually destroy the intestinal lining or the intestine?
Yeah, it produces a toxin that destroys the guts of the insects that eat it. So you could say, well, that doesn't affect our gut, but it'd be pretty surprising that it's so specific to the insect gut that it doesn't hurt our gut, Heard about, I think it was gerbils that were studied through several generations, and they showed epigenetic effects that survived through multiple generations, when even only the first generation was exposed. And I think it was exposed to glyphosate, and then you would have a change in the epigenetics that would be carried through in multiple subsequent generations. So we're going to see the residue of this glyphosate poisoning long after the glyphosate is gone. I mean, I have confidence that eventually we're going to ban this stuff. I don't know how long it's going to take, but people are waking up, and we should ban it from the earth right now. We should just stop making this chemical. It is that toxic. Yeah. But who am I to say, right? I don't have enough force to make that happen, but that's what I think.
It seems like there's a lot of money, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of momentum invested into this. Now, some people, like to jump straight to the conspiracy style analysis of it, but I mean, if you just look at the monetary investment, the emotional investment that these individuals have, I mean, there's a lot of people's jobs that are riding on getting research grants, and if you start coming out against these things, it seems like there can be a pretty big backlash professionally in the field. Have you seen any backlash with among your colleagues? I know that you're not monetarily invested in the food industry, which is great. You could say what you want, but do you get any resistance?
MIT doesn't get any funding from Monsanto. MIT has not tried to stop me from doing this research. So I really give them a lot of credit for MIT is a pretty liberal place, and they seem to be so far okay with what I'm doing. I mean, it's kind of surprising because certainly there's a lot of repercussions from the industry, and the industry, of course, is trying to depict me as a lunatic, a wacko or whatever. That's what they do to people. They really are trying to discredit me.
It's very apparent to me.
Mode of attack.
I can look at your Wikipedia page, for instance.
I know.
So if you look at Stephanie Seneff's Wikipedia page, you can tell. I mean, now I've got a very critical eye, and I've been watching the way that Wikipedia is used as a social engineering tool. I've been looking at this for decades, for a decade rather, because it's only been around since I was in college. But yeah, anybody can edit Wikipedia, and there is a political aspect to it. And if you look at it, for some reason, they quote a food blogger in the first paragraph. They quote some food blogger trying to discredit you. And it's I mean, why? It's like if you were to go to Obama's Wikipedia page, it would be like if they put some conspiracy blogger said that Obama's birth certificate wasn't valid in the first sentence. That would be akin to this. So I mean, you have to be critical when you're looking at these things and take it for what it is. It costs a lot of money to.
People need to become aware that this is what's happening, so that they can look beyond these kinds of things. Once they see a wiki page like that, describing some person as being someone you should be suspicious of, that's a person you should find out more about.
I think it's very important that you look into their information, because if you are afraid to look at information and using your emotions and allowing yourself to be dragged this way and that way, you become a tool of social engineering and of linguistic tricks that can get played.
It's very effective, unfortunately, because plenty of people will say, well, okay, I shouldn't believe this person because all these people say that, and therefore I don't want to spend my effort trying to find out what this person is saying, Yeah. That's a lot of people react that way. So I always try to keep an open mind, and especially when I see someone being attacked, that's when my ears perk up. I'm like, okay, this person is saying something that's bothering them,
Absolutely.
And therefore they probably have valuable information that I should know. So I tend to go deeper into those people who are being attacked, because I think they're the ones you need to be paying attention to.
Yes.
So I wear it as a badge of honor.
Glyphosate. By what mechanism does glyphosate kill plants, and how might this affect human biology and animal biology? And then maybe we can get into some of the demonstrable, provable research that you've been compiling over the years.
Yeah, so glyphosate, and this is what Monsanto says about glyphosate, that it disrupts the shikimate pathway, which is an important pathway in plants and also in most microbes. And the shikimate pathway is a biological pathway that produces the aromatic amino acids. And those amino acids are essential to us because our cells can't make them. And our cells can't make those amino acids because they don't have this pathway. So when you think about that, you say, okay, our gut microbes have this pathway. Glyphosate disrupts it. So the microbes can't make these essential amino acids, which means we're going to have deficiencies because our cells have no other recourse except to rely on the microbes to make them for us. So what happens is we get a systemic deficiency in these essential amino acids, which then has widespread consequences. And of course, the gut microbes get messed up as well. There's a specific microbe, lactobacillus, which is really important when you're born. That's the one that really needs to get going and produce a large mass of lactobacillus, which will chase out the pathogens. And that bacteria particularly depends on manganese it's very interesting the way that microbe works, that it doesn't depend on iron, but it does depend on manganese instead. And so glyphosate makes manganese unavailable. It's very good at chelating manganese and hiding it so that it gets attached to the glyphosate molecule, and the lactobacillus cannot gain access to the manganese. So with manganese deficiency, they collapse. The lactobacillus don't thrive. These other pathogens start growing wildly, and then you get this inflammatory reaction because your immune cells come in and start attacking the pathogens. You get a leaky gut, inflammatory gut, all these gut issues, and you get food issues as well. So the autistic kids have a lot of problems with the gut. That was something I was well aware of long before I knew about glyphosate. So that was one thing I really perked up on when Don Huber talked about that. He said the soil microbes and the gut microbes are going to be disrupted by glyphosate. And that's what because I was looking for something that would disrupt the gut microbes in autism. That was a good match.
All right, because everybody knows, well, not everybody, but it's being widely discussed now, the gut-brain connection, how intimately the immune system is tied to your gut microbiome, and this is kind of the new frontier in science. The new human genome project is like the new human butthole project. It's
The microbiome.
human microbiome research is massive. So, wow,
Yes.
I mean that's very interesting. So by chelating the soil as well, I mean, is it blocking the uptake of manganese in all plants in the soil that it's sprayed on?
Exactly. And in fact, Huber showed that, tremendous reduction in the amount of manganese that gets into the plant that's exposed to glyphosate. So you can imagine then the food is also deficient in manganese.
What about other things? I mean, magnesium deficiency seems to be a big thing. Vitamin D deficiency as well,
Yes.
chronic disease. Do these
Vitamin
things
D,
kind of...
yes, vitamin D definitely connected to glyphosate. Glyphosate disrupts a class of enzymes in the liver called the cytochrome P450 enzymes. And these enzymes are really important for lots of things. One of the things is bile acids. So you get a disrupted bile flow. And bile acids are needed to digest fats, among many other things. The cytochrome P450 enzymes also activate vitamin D in the liver. So if you can call them CYP enzymes for short. So if CYP enzymes aren't working, vitamin D does not get activated, and that will give you the low vitamin D in your serum, because what you measure is the activated vitamin D. So we have a tremendous epidemic in vitamin D deficiency in the U.S. They've become very aware of it, in the last 10 years. And of course, their answer is just to load us up on vitamin D supplements, which is really not the right solution.
While avoiding the sun, at all costs.
Exactly.
Don't go out in the sun.
I know, that's so funny, isn't it? I mean, I can talk about the sun too, because I really am a sun worshiper, and I think that the sun is vitally important for our health. And the plants, the sun is essential to the plants for chlorophyll production. But we also depend on the sun. It would be silly, when you think about biology evolving and to know there's this wonderful resource out there, an energy source, the sun, it would be foolish not to use that. And so it makes no sense whatsoever that we're completely incompetent to deal with the sunlight. Yeah. And in fact, we have very excellent mechanisms for capturing that sunlight energy. And in my opinion, I've written papers about this, that in the skin, exposed to the sun, the skin cells and also the red blood cells produce sulfate from reduced sulfur sources. So it's really, really cool that they take the energy in the sun and they capture it in that sulfate molecule. Mm-hmm. And they do so safely, so that they also deflect the UV rays and make them safe by virtue of the way the whole thing operates. But that enzyme that produces the sulfate is also a cytochrome P450 enzyme. So glyphosate is going to disrupt that as well in the red blood cells. And that's going to cause a great deal of stress to the red blood cells. In fact, it's been shown that glyphosate causes the red blood cells to fall apart. It basically causes anemia, and we have an epidemic in anemia worldwide these days as well, which I think is due to glyphosate.
So if glyphosate is sprayed on a field, for instance, this is going to drastically disrupt the lactobacillus, the beneficial microorganisms that are necessary in the soil to break down organic matter and make it bioavailable for the roots of this plant to then suck up and create herbaceous growth. This is pretty amazing that something like this could be considered safe for human consumption. I mean, we look at, I see the soil microbiome as kind of it's intimately connected to our own gut microbiome. And I mean, our gut does the same thing that the soil's doing. We're breaking
It's really a good analogy that the plant's gut is the soil,
Yeah, it's like the plants, I mean, the entire plant kingdom, they are intimately connected with the fungal kingdom as well. I mean, does glyphosate also introduce toxins that might disrupt the growth of beneficial fungus and mushrooms?
Absolutely, yeah. The what do they call the
mycorrhizal?
Yes, mycorrhizal fungi. Yes, those guys are so cool, aren't they? And they get disrupted by glyphosate. It's all about balance, and it gets tremendously imbalanced in the soil and in the gut in response to glyphosate.
Yeah. So all right. So glyphosate chelating the soil. I've also heard it described as an antibiotic.
Yes, it was patented as an antimicrobial agent, and it kills many, many bacteria. Unfortunately, it preferentially kills the beneficial bacteria in the gut, and that's what's causing the overgrowth of the pathogens.
Wow.
And I think it's also causing the antibiotic resistance. There's a very interesting study that came out recently on glyphosate that showed that chronic exposure of low doses of glyphosate to E. coli and other microbes gave them a special skill to be able to very quickly adapt to other antibiotics that they're exposed to, and so to quickly become resistant. And this is a well-known feature, actually, that one antibiotic, low-dose exposure to one antibiotic, gives these microbes an edge towards getting resistance to other antibiotics. Really interesting. So we've got this massive problem right now in America, certainly in the hospitals, with runaway antibiotic-resistant bugs like MRSA and C. difficile, and the people are getting these infections that they can't heal, and they throw all kinds of antibiotics at it, and it still continues to rage. They end up dying. I mean, it's just really scary right now in the hospitals what's going on. And I suspect that glyphosate is playing a major role in causing that issue.
Okay, so not only is this a broad-spectrum antibiotic that chelates important minerals, now, here's a question: Would this be creating mineral deficiencies in our food?
Absolutely. I think there's mineral deficiencies in the food, and then there's also inability for the microbes to obtain the minerals in the gut, because the glyphosate is holding on to the minerals in the gut, particularly manganese and cobalt. There was a study in cows that showed tremendous deficiencies in manganese and cobalt in these cows that were being fed GMO Roundup Ready feed. Particularly those two minerals. I mean, there's other ones that are also affected, like zinc and magnesium you mentioned. I mean, these are also affected, but I think and copper probably, I suspect, is also being messed up. And it's not just that it's making it unavailable, it's that it's messing up the whole body's natural transport system for the minerals. So you find iron in particular. We have anemia, epidemic in anemia. Iron is one of the things that glyphosate messes up. But glyphosate not only holds on to the iron, but also messes up the microbes' ability to produce the iron-carrying molecules, and in fact, our own cells as well, because glyphosate disrupts the synthesis of heme, for example, which is in hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is what carries the iron in the red blood cells. So by virtue of interfering with the synthesis of heme and also disrupting the red blood cells and causing them to die, so you're releasing free iron into the blood. So we have right now an interesting epidemic in both iron deficiency and iron toxicity, iron overload, both simultaneously. Because the iron is in the wrong place. You've got free iron, which is really toxic through the Fenton reaction. It can cause all kinds of collateral damage to neighboring tissues. And at the same time, the actual iron that you need to catalyze all these enzymes is not available.
Now, could this be negatively affecting brain function as well?
Yeah, and then manganese is even more interesting. Anthony and I wrote a whole paper on manganese, glyphosate and manganese. It was a very fascinating study that we did, and we discovered that what we think is happening is that manganese is piling up in the liver because glyphosate is disrupting the flow of bile. I mentioned the cytochrome P450 enzymes. So the manganese usually is exported from the liver, attached to the bile, and then eventually works its way to the entire system through the starting with the lymph system and then going out into the blood and distributing the manganese throughout the body. That whole process gets blocked by glyphosate. So what happens is the manganese piles up in the liver to toxic levels. So the liver has a toxic overload of manganese, and the rest of the body has a deficiency. And then what happens is the manganese actually travels along the vagus nerve, because manganese has a very special property that it can ride on nerves. It can move along nerve fibers. Very unusual.
And the vagus nerve connects the brain with the gut directly.
You pile the manganese up into the brainstem, and then you get a manganese excess in the brainstem, and that gives you things like Parkinson's disease. And glyphosate is linked to Parkinson's disease.
These are some very alarming functions that glyphosate might disrupt in the body. Something else you mentioned in some of your other presentations was glycine.
Glycine is really, really important. I mean, first of all, it has other activities besides going into proteins. All the amino acids, of course, are the coding units of the proteins. You build amino acids as beads on a string to make a protein. Really fascinating how this works. And the proteins are the workhorses of the body. They're all the enzymes, the ion channels, the transporters, all these things, the receptors. They're all proteins. They're very, very important in the body. And there's only about 20 amino acids, coding amino acids in the proteins, and glycine is one of them. And glyphosate is a glycine molecule. It has an extra thing attached to the nitrogen. So the most recent thing that Anthony and I have been working, Anthony Samsel again, we've written several papers together. And last December, Anthony hypothesized, he proposed to me that he suspected glyphosate was going into proteins by mistake in place of glycine. And it was like an incredible idea to me. At first, I was thinking, I was skeptical, that doesn't seem like it could happen. But he said, no, take a look, because he was seeing, that if you do assume this is happening, then all of a sudden you can explain all these correlations. He said, it really can go a long ways towards explaining things that we haven't yet been able to explain. Now, such as the connections to diabetes, and even some of the direct connections to Alzheimer's and autism. These things turn out to be very easily explained if you assume glyphosate can substitute for glycine in proteins.
Say, for instance, glyphosate is being taken up as glycine. Would that mean that meat that people are eating could possibly have, heavy contamination of glyphosate stuck in the collagen matrix of that?
Exactly. Very good choice, because collagen has loads of glycine in it. It's like a quarter of the amino acids in collagen are glycine. And I think that's why we have a lot of problems with joints these days. We have so many people who have joint issues. They've got aching shoulders and back pain and knee problems and foot problems.
And a lot of these people, when they start looking, what can I do to take control of this? I mean, there's many people now who are searching for, they realize that just going to your doctor, having them, whack your knee with a rubber hammer and tell you everything's fine, take this pill and you'll be okay, it doesn't really work for a lot of these more complicated things. You get a 15-minute checkup, you pay a $150 copay, and you're out of there. So some people are taking control of things like their diet. And it seems like going gluten-free is a really big, it's like a craze. And a lot of these people who go gluten-free, their joint pain goes away. They start getting, their symptoms get better. Now, it doesn't really completely heal them, but for some of these individuals, it makes a huge difference. So that's a very interesting connection.
See, the gluten protein actually has a lot of proline in it, and proline is very difficult to break down. And there's a special enzyme that breaks down the proline to help metabolize the gluten protein. And that enzyme crucially depends on multiple places. I think there's 3 places in that enzyme where it essentially depends on glycine. So if those glycines are replaced with glyphosate, that enzyme doesn't work. Gluten can't be broken down. And you've got the leaky gut to go with it. So the gluten just gets out into the bloodstream. And then that's how you're going to get an autoimmune reaction, because you'll get an antibody reaction to the gluten, and then that becomes an autoimmune reaction to various proteins in your body. And that can cause, for example, thyroid issues because of a match between the gluten protein and the proteins in the thyroid gland. So that's just one example. I think all of these food allergies, peanuts, wheat, soy, all these food allergies that we're seeing today in the kids, I think are all attributable to glyphosate substituting for glycine in the protein.
Were we seeing these food allergies 50, 60 years ago before glyphosate was heavily used? Were people allergic to peanuts widely, or were a lot of people have problems with wheat, celiac disease, stuff like that 50 years ago?
Nothing. I mean, when I was a kid, I didn't know anybody who had any food allergies. Zero.
Right. Well, I mean, same here. I grew up in the 90s, and I didn't know people. There was no talk of, I gotta get off the gluten. Nobody knew what gluten was.
I know. All of a sudden, wheat has become a bad food. I mean, wheat is not a bad food. Wheat is actually quite healthy. Yeah. But when you fill full of glyphosate, because they spray it right before the harvest with glyphosate. It's not GMO, but it's the desiccant. They use it as a desiccant right before the harvest.
Not just GMO foods are being sprayed heavily with glyphosate.
Right.
Okay. So at the end of the
peanuts
harvest,
are too, by the way. Peanuts and wheat are both sprayed right before the harvest, and also sugar cane. I mean, these are really core foods.
Yeah, and this is fascinating. And I guess at the end of the harvest, they want their plants to die and dry up, because when a plant goes to seed, it's because it's done. I mean, either the light cycle has changed, which everything is intimately connected to light cycles. The internal clock genes and everything are crucial to our health and to the health of plants as well. So I guess to dry them up, they just kill the plant and then they thresh it.
Yes, they found it works very well, and it's been increasingly adopted on the wheat, the peanuts, and on the barley that goes into beer. So all the beers are contaminated with glyphosate, unfortunately.
Wow.
Even the European beers, which is very disappointing.
This is a recent increase in the use of glyphosate, correct?
Yes, it's become more and more popular as various farmers have tried it and it's worked out for them, because again, there's a lot of advantages, right? Because you get a head start on next year's weeds too, because you can just simultaneously kill the weeds when you kill the crop, and then you also cut back on the effort that it takes for the combine to clear the field, all the stuff you do after the crop is done. And it synchronizes the harvest, so you get a greater yield because all the plants go to seed simultaneously. So there's all these upsides, and the only downside is that you poison everybody with glyphosate because it's a massive celiac disease epidemic. It seems very clear to me that that's what's causing that epidemic, and it's frustrating actually that so few people think of that as a possibility. It just makes so much sense, and we didn't have, we didn't have gluten-free sections in the grocery stores even 10 years ago. You
Right.
know, it's come up everywhere.
Right. Yeah, this is very, very interesting. I mean, when you do, it's like there's an exponential rise in the use of glyphosate, an exponential rise in these autoimmune reactions that people are getting to foods, and simply switching to like a whole foods organic diet for a lot of people makes a massive difference in their vitality, their energy, and their health.
That's
I mean, this is kind of how I got into all this. Was I was not doing too well health-wise. I didn't feel very good. My body composition was poor, and I was in a lot of pain through injuries and through, growing up with minor scoliosis and stuff like that. And changing my diet was a huge step in taking control of my health and taking responsibility for it. So
it's very gratifying when you hear these anecdotal stories of individuals who solved their problem through diet just by going organic. You hear more and more testimonials of this sort, and it really makes you confident that you're right about this. And of course, it's not just the glyphosate. There's all kinds of other chemicals in the food as well.
Yeah, no, this is amazing. But I think glyphosate's a really good banner issue for people to discuss because it is so widely used. The correlation aspect is so strong. Now, all right, so looking at it from the other side, from the critics of your work, who seem to be food bloggers and editorial publishers parading around as scientists, I don't understand it. It's very, very interesting when you read some of the critiques on it. A lot of these articles, they'll start out with just some snide comments trying to make you sound like a hippie, make you associate you with anti-GMO activism. But when you really look at the core argument against what you're saying, it just comes down to correlation does not equal causation.
I know, that's really frustrating.
We all know that correlation does not equal causation, but when there's enough correlation, we need to dig deeper into this and study the mechanisms and maybe do things like test for glyphosate contamination in collagen matrices of animals that are being given GMO corn feed.
That would be so perfect. Yes, absolutely.
Could this be done? Will this be done?
I hope so. I mean, I don't have a chemistry lab, but I've been trying to encourage people to think in terms of doing this. I expect there will be someone who finally happens to have the right setup where they can do it and they know what to do and they just feel interested enough, curious enough to go ahead and check it out, because you could actually prove that glyphosate is accumulating in collagen. It'd be a really good place to look for. I see how the experiment could go, which would actually show that glyphosate is going into the protein, because you could grow fibroblasts in vitro in a culture and feed them everything they need to make collagen, and then feed them radio-labeled glyphosate in different doses, and then see how much of that glyphosate comes out in the pure collagen that you could extract. Mm-hmm. You could also look at the collagen and see if it's disturbed, because the collagen, I think the glyphosate would mess up the crystalline structure. Collagen forms this neat triple helix in the way that it works. With all these glycines are really important for that flexibility. And if it's got a bunch of glyphosates in there, it's not going to form an adequate triple helix, and that's going to mess up the quality of your joints and cause all this joint pain.
Right. And all right, so just speaking of collagen, collagen seems very important for the creation of electrical current in the body. If anybody's looked at Dr. Robert Becker's work, are you familiar with The Body Electric, his book?
Yes.
Fascinating work on the.
It is. I'm fascinated by the electricity in the body. I think it's super, super important.
Yeah. So if you have a molecule that will interrupt things like iron. It seems like this collagen matrix being contaminated with glyphosate could create huge problems just for sending electrical current and signals throughout the body, and maybe this could connect with things like the rise in MS, autism, and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah, I think there's a lot of autoimmune disease going on. I think that MS and autism are both going to turn out to be recognized as autoimmune diseases. In fact, autism, very, very interesting what I'm finding with the MMR vaccine. There was a whole series of papers that were written by a person whose last name is Singh, Singh. A whole series going back to before 2000. This person obviously became obsessed with this idea, which I think is absolutely correct. And he showed the autistic kids. The most interesting study to me was something he wrote, I think, in 2002 or 2003. Where he had 125 autistic kids and he had over 90 control kids who didn't have autism. And he measured their antibody response to a protein called hemagglutinin, which is produced by the measles virus in the vaccine. And that's the protein that you need to get antibodies to in order for the vaccine to take. That's what you're looking for, is antibodies to hemagglutinin. Well, these autistic kids had way too many antibodies, really high titers of antibodies to hemagglutinin, way beyond the level that the non-autistic kids had. 60% of them had really high levels. And those 60%, 90% of them had autoantibodies to myelin basic protein, which is a core protein in the brain, in the myelin sheath, in the nerve fibers. So what happens then is you get an autoimmune attack of the nerve fibers in the brain. And so these authors are saying that this autoimmune attack on the nerve fibers is what's causing the autistic symptoms. It's really a pretty stunning idea. And when you think about the measles virus live vaccine growing on gelatin that's derived from the ligaments of pigs that are fed heavy doses of glyphosate in their feed, you have to suspect that there could be glyphosate in the vaccine itself. Yeah. And this is something that Anthony and I are trying to figure out. I mean, I think if that's true, it's devastating, because the MMR vaccine is much more toxic today than it used to be.
I think it's very important to set these things aside, set sensationalism, marketing, and all this aside, because a lot of the sensationalism is simply marketing to sell products anyways. And really look at these issues and really objectively look at the facts and the possible mechanisms behind this. Now, that's a fascinating possible correlation there that should definitely be explored. All right, so we talked about glycine, the relationship to glycine. We talked about the chelation of the soil, the antibiotic properties of this. Now, how much glyphosate is actually in the foods we eat? I mean, are we extrapolating some impossible situation? I guess what I'm asking is, are we really getting enough glyphosate dietarily through our food supply that it could cause these problems? Or is this just theoretical? We're kind of blowing it out of proportion because it's, maybe I guess a critic would say it's a pet theory. We're looking through a glyphosate-colored lenses, perhaps. How much glyphosate are we being exposed to? I mean, is this really a problem?
Yeah, well, the U.S. government has been very irresponsible because they haven't really measured very little of it. Anthony Samsel actually harassed them to measure, because they put out a huge report from the USDA, Department of Agriculture, showing all the different measures they had done of different toxic chemicals in the food, and they wouldn't even bother to test for glyphosate, even though it's by far the most used herbicide in the country.
Well, so when you get a certificate of analysis on food products, like if you're going to import a product, if you're buying from a manufacturer, you need a certificate of analysis. In California, you're only allowed like 0.02 parts per million lead, stuff like that. I mean, we're looking at parts per million. So how much glyphosate is allowed in food legally? I mean, and we're not really even testing for it, so I guess it doesn't really matter anyways.
I know, yeah. They have some levels that they report on certain foods, so you can actually look to see which foods have residue limits, and you can bet money those are foods where they have found glyphosate, because they have done some testing. They did a report in, I think it was 2012. They did a big report on all these different chemicals. It's like, several hundred pages of stuff, and in that report they had only one line on glyphosate. This was through Anthony's pressure. They looked at glyphosate in soy. They had 300 samples of soybeans, and they found that something like 91% of the samples came out positive for glyphosate, and 96 positive for AMPA, which is a breakdown product of glyphosate.
So they're only looking positive or negative. They're not even counting parts per billion or parts per million.
They had parts per billion, and they were all underneath their upper limit, which I think was 20 parts per million. I'm not sure. 20
million or billion. Yeah.
20. Yeah.
So are these in this kind of minute amount? Some people would hear that and they think that's a really small amount. How do we know that small amount of an exposure to glyphosate could affect us biologically?
Well, so it's interesting. There was a study done on breast cancer cells grown in vitro, and they exposed them to glyphosate at levels of parts per trillion. And they showed that induced proliferation, so it caused the tumor to grow.
Wow.
In levels of parts per trillion.
That's fascinating and absolutely horrifying in a lot of ways. So we're talking parts per trillion can have negative effects, and legally, even if it's parts per billion that are allowed, even if it's 20 parts per billion, if parts per trillion are affecting breast cancer cells, that's very alarming. Now, of course, that's in vitro, right?
In vitro, yeah.
So you could say, well, in vivo, we would need, so much glyphosate, I guess would be an argument.
Yeah, and there's been a recent study, I think, on rats that exposed them to small levels of glyphosate and showed effects on the uterus that were suggestive of estrogenic effects. And this paper on the breast tumors definitely linked it to estrogenic effects. So glyphosate acts as a hormone, as an estrogenic hormone, which has interesting consequences in terms of messing up development and messing up sexual development. And in fact, Nancy Swanson is one who's looked at a lot of the data for trends in different diseases. And recently, she and I have been looking at infertility. Looking at infertility measured as teen pregnancy. Mm-hmm. So the teen pregnancy rates in the United States have been going steadily down, pretty much steadily down since glyphosate was first widely used, going back 20 years.
We've also had like family planning things increasing too, so I guess that's kind of a hard one.
It's hard to argue exactly which effects, but I suspect that glyphosate is playing a role in increasing our infertility problems. We have a huge problem with infertility too, and a growing problem with all kinds of people, seeking infertility clinics and all that kind of thing, in vitro fertilization. It's a booming business.
That's huge.
And I think there's probably lots of things that are contributing, but I suspect glyphosate is going to turn out to be one of them that's contributing to infertility.
Very, very interesting. So I really enjoyed your talk with Jason Perrault. You talked a lot about cholesterol sulfate. And
yes, my favorite molecule.
yeah, your favorite molecule other than glyphosate. Right. Glyphosate would probably be your least favorite molecule. So maybe let's get into a little bit of how glyphosate can affect cholesterol sulfate and how this might affect us negatively down the line, because my audience is very familiar with the facts that fats are not bad for you. Cholesterol in itself is not dangerous, that it's a part of an intricate systems within systems that are trying to keep the body in balance and healthy and able to reproduce, which our ability to reproduce somehow seems to be greatly diminished these days. But how is cholesterol sulfate affected by glyphosate?
Yeah, well, so cholesterol cholesterol sulfate is produced in the skin in large amounts. The skin is believed to be the major source of cholesterol sulfate in the body, and it forms a barrier. It helps to keep microbes out of the skin, so it will help to protect you from infection. But the cholesterol sulfate is also released into the blood, and the red blood cells also make cholesterol sulfate, and they put the cholesterol sulfate in their membranes. And so what's really interesting is that if you think of cholesterol in the membrane, with the sulfate sticking out, sulfate is negatively charged. So the red blood cell sort of has negative charge all around it because of the sulfate that's hooked to the cholesterol that's in the membrane. And this makes the red blood cells repel each other, so they don't stick together. And it's really, really important for the blood to flow to have that cholesterol sulfate. And the sulfate is synthesized, in our papers, we talk about the synthesis of sulfate by this molecule called eNOS, which I mentioned to you earlier. Did I mention eNOS as a cytochrome P450 enzyme?
Yeah. Okay.
Right, because it's in the red blood cells. eNOS is in the red blood cells, and it hangs out along the membrane. When eNOS is attached to the membrane, according to our theory, it produces sulfate when it's attached to the membrane. When it detaches from the membrane, it makes nitric oxide, which turns into nitrate. So there's a yin and yang. It's a dual-purpose enzyme that makes both sulfate and nitrate, and has intricate control in signaling from the outside to tell it which one to make at any particular point in time. And sulfate and nitrate are complementary in terms of turning the blood into thickening versus thinning the blood. So the nitrate thins the blood, and the sulfate thickens the blood. And you need to have the blood at exactly the right viscosity to be working well. So this is an ingenious method that the body has come up with to have a single molecule that can be switched back and forth between those two, depending on need, in response to signaling that's coming in from the outside world. So it's really cool, that whole mechanism. But the sulfate synthesis, eNOS, is a cytochrome P450 enzyme, so it's going to be disrupted by glyphosate because of that. More than that, and this is something we found out recently with this glycine idea, eNOS actually has an essential glycine unit at the very end of the molecule. And that glycine is essential for hooking the molecule onto the membrane. On the membrane is where it makes the sulfate. So if that glycine is replaced by glyphosate, it cannot hook to the membrane. It would completely disrupt its ability to hook to the membrane, and therefore its ability to make sulfate. So I suspect that eNOS sulfate synthesis is severely impaired in the presence of glyphosate, and that is causing a systemic sulfate deficiency problem in all of us. We have a huge problem with sulfate deficiency in the United States and probably in many other parts of the world.
Now, sulfate deficiency, how can this affect things like vitamin D or other important processes in the body?
Yeah, well, vitamin D is sulfated in the skin as well. So the skin produces both cholesterol sulfate and vitamin D sulfate in response to sunlight, and ships them out into the blood. So they're going to supply those really important nutrients to the body. When there's not enough cholesterol sulfate, then you've got to package cholesterol up inside those LDL particles. So you end up with high serum LDL, which is this high cholesterol thing that everybody's taking statin drugs for. So I think the high cholesterol is indirectly caused by the lack of sulfation capacity, because you can no longer ship the cholesterol the same way. You have to hide it inside these fat-containing molecules or particles.
Wow.
And the vitamin D, so vitamin D is sulfated also, and I think vitamin D and cholesterol are both sulfate carriers. I've looked into this whole idea of there are many, many molecules that are biologically very important, both all the sterols like cholesterol and vitamin D, and all the sex hormones, like testosterone and estrogen and cortisol, and then all the aromatic amino acids that are produced by that pathway that glyphosate disrupts, tryptophan, tyrosine, phenylalanine, and their products, which are neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, melatonin. These are really, really important molecules in the body. All of them, and also thyroid hormone, all of them are sulfated in transit. They so you make it, you put a sulfate on it, and you ship it out. And I believe those things are shipping sulfate, distributing it throughout the body. That's what they're doing. That's one of their most important roles. This is my own theory. This is not something you'll see from other people.
Well, these are things that need to be explored. I mean, it's just everything is theory. I mean, we've got the theory of evolution, the theory of universal gravitation. I mean, these are theoretical frameworks which we use to describe what is. Because, I mean, you work with language in MIT. You're probably well aware of how profoundly inefficient language is at portraying most ideas. So, wow, that is fascinating. I mean, we're talking about we've pretty much named almost every major system of the body being just very, very drastically disrupted by this chemical that is so widely used and so widely accepted as safe. So this might be, a lot of people might be kind of freaking out about this or even tuning out, because it's like, well, what can I do? A lot of people are of the opinion that they cannot afford to eat organic foods. A lot of people think that organic foods are more expensive. So maybe we can transition into some strategies that people might be able to adopt in their life, in their lifestyle, in their food choices, in their lifestyle choices on how can we mitigate this? How can we live a life and introduce or promote vitality in our life so we aren't so negatively affected by this? Because if even non-GMO crops are showing glyphosate contamination, and if even organic wine in California was recently shown to have glyphosate contamination, if the groundwater being tested in most of the country has been shown to be contaminated heavily with glyphosate, if 90% of the rain tested worldwide has been showing glyphosate contamination, I mean, what can we do here, Dr. Seneff?
Yeah, I certainly think eating an organic diet is a really good place to start, and we do that in my family. We buy only 100% certified organic everything, including our spices, our alcoholic beverages. Everything is 100% organic in our home. It's hard to stay with organic when you eat out, so we don't eat out very much. And when we eat out, we try to choose the things that are less likely to be contaminated with glyphosate, and we joke about being poisoned while we're eating, so it kind of makes the dinner not quite as much fun as it might otherwise be. So it's hard to eat out. We need to get the restaurants on board with at least offering the organic choice. They offer the low-carb choice or the low-fat choice. They should offer the organic choice, and then that would help to encourage people who are...
Well, this is happening. There's a huge welling up of support for the organic movement. And it's getting...
I heard there's going to be a new organic fast food coming out. Fast foods.
I heard that too. Yeah.
Company. Yeah. I don't remember the name, but that's really great. I think that is a terrific thing to do. An organic fast food, I think, would really, really sell right now. This is the right time.
And Costco, even Costco has been really moving towards providing organic foods. It's one of the biggest growing industries in the United States, and this is truly grassroots. We're not talking the evil organic lobby. If you look at some of these,
I know
some of the retorts to the questions that Dr. Seneff is positing here. A lot of the retorts are just loading up languages and kind of personal insults and stuff like that. And there seems to be this. They try to portray this idea that there's some sort of an organic food coalition that's just pumping money towards making people afraid of GMOs, and it's irrational, and it's regressive, and it's going to kill all the people in India and Africa who can't get food. But this is complete opposite of what I see going on.
It's funny that they're actually accusing us of playing their game, because of right?
We don't have the money for that, you know what I'm saying?
I know.
So come on.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely worth it to go organic. I think the extra money you spend on food, you will save enormously in your lack of medical costs for all those horrible diseases that you don't get. Just think of coming down with Alzheimer's, having to spend the last 20 years of your life unable to take care of yourself. If you can avoid that by simply converting to organic food, why wouldn't you do it? It just, people have to believe that that's true. I certainly believe it, and I'm very concerned about trying to keep my glyphosate levels as low as possible, because I don't want to spend the last part of my life with Alzheimer's. I really do not,
Absolutely. I mean, it's huge. If you can even make simple... I mean, a lot of people switch to organic and they'll get great improvements. Sometimes, of course, if your gut's completely destroyed, simply switching to organic is not going to replenish the gut bacteria. So how else can we go about this? I mean, we're talking about our gut-brain connection being disrupted, the rates of autism going up, dementia increasing, and people with Alzheimer's in their 50s and 60s. This is alarming. So what else can we do?
So organic food, and then probiotic foods, things like live culture yogurts and sauerkraut and sour cream, and all of these sort of cheeses, that have microbes. So trying to refurbish your gut microbiome. And you can take probiotic pills. I have never tried to do that, but they're certainly available. Right. And then soups. I really recommend soups. My husband's a great cook. He does the cooking in my family, thank goodness, and he's very good at cooking everything organic. And he gets organic. For example, you get a whole organic chicken and use the meat, cook organic chicken dishes, and then you've got the carcass left, and you throw the carcass in the water and you cook it slow heat for several hours, and that brings all the minerals out of the bones, because you get a natural balance of various minerals in the water.
Right, and if glycine is being interrupted, then we do kind of need to increase the glycine. Yeah, so things like bone broth. I mean, we've always got grass-fed bone broth on the pot here.
Grass-fed bone broth is fantastic, and to get those minerals back. And also you can use sea salt, Mediterranean sea salt, to help get your minerals back, because the minerals are definitely deficient in the modern diet. Eating whole foods, of course. So eating organic and eating whole foods. Don't buy processed foods, period. Even if they're organic, at least try to minimize, your consumption of these processed foods. And I think a high-fat diet, I mean, I really am a believer in a high-fat diet, high-cholesterol diet. So, for example, seafood and organic eggs. Eggs are a really good deal. You can get, even at the expensive level of organic eggs, it's still a good deal, because they are so full of nutrients.
Well, people can have their own chickens, too. I mean, you could raise your own chickens. You could feed them table scraps, so you can...
I know. I love that idea, actually. That's so cool. And it used to be like that. I know. People used to just have chickens in the backyard, right? But often today, it's not allowed in very suburban neighborhoods. You can't have chickens. So, we've got all these restrictions.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like the movement of populations into cities, into urban centers, where we're very disconnected from the foods, makes it very easy for us to never really think about food quality. It's like, hey, the food's in the grocery store. That's where it comes from. It's Safeway or Vons or whatever it is in your area. And yeah, I think the disconnection from our food supply, people should become aware of where your food comes from. I mean, shopping at local farmers markets and stuff like that.
Yes, absolutely. That's a very good thing to do, and we frequent the farmers markets ourselves. And eating a lot of garlic is important, because garlic and onions and cruciferous vegetables are all really good vegetarian sources of sulfur, and sulfur deficiency is rampant. Sulfur deficiency and sulfate deficiency go together, because sulfate comes from sulfur.
I think people need to take heed of where their food comes from. Take control of take responsibility for your health, and take responsibility of where you're getting your food from. I mean, we vote with our dollars every day. It sounds corny. We've heard it so many times, but we really are changing the way the economy works by focusing on monetary energy on products that we believe are going to be beneficial long term for our family, for the earth, and for what we want to see.
That's right. I mean, you can really feel when you spend your money on grass-fed beef that you're actually helping climate change, because that cow was eating grass, and that's actually a very healthy process to renew. The cow eating the grass actually helps the grass to be healthy, which is really interesting. That I've learned from some of my friends who promote grass-fed beef. Whereas if you've got the cows in the CAFOs, eating all that toxic food and producing toxic waste, I mean, everything is bad. And you end up with massive problems with algae overgrowth in the water because of the runoff from the manure that's coming out of the cows. I mean, it's just ridiculous that you're wasting, because manure can be a very valuable thing if you've got a cow eating grass organically. But now you've ruined the manure because it's loaded with glyphosate. Right. So it's all wrong microbes in there anyway, because you've got the gut microbiome all messed up. So it just messes up everything when you do these things so ridiculously wrong, chemically motivated. Agriculture just doesn't make any sense. You've got those pure phosphate and nitrate fertilizers rather than having the organic richness of the manure, which, if it's from the grass-fed beef, it's a very healthy system. And we need to just go back to that.
This is how things have been going in the natural world for thousands, millions of years. This is not some new idea on, hey, we shouldn't spray phosphate fertilizers on everything and chelate the soil. Once you've grown with glyphosate and once you've used chemical agriculture on land, you can't just grow organic foods on that land. It takes years to remediate soil. I mean, even here in Ecuador, in our yard back here, for instance, we've got a lot of clay, a lot of rocks and stuff like that. It's not heavily contaminated with glyphosate, as far as we know, hopefully. But it is hard to remediate soil. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of organic matter, a lot of input, and it takes years to build that deep black, like really good soil. So when you're focusing on organic foods, you are promoting soil health and the microbial diversity of the earth. You're supporting the microbial diversity of your gut microbiome. And these things are not separate. We're not separate from our environment. So I think just looking at things as interconnected can be a huge step in people taking control of what they're putting in their body and voting with their actions and creating this economy, which it's building, but I don't think it's building fast enough. You know what I'm saying? There's still...
Right, I know it needs to build faster. I mean, I'm encouraged. There is almost exponential growth in organic in the United States, which is really great. I mean, it's small still, but it's growing fast. So I'm hoping that will continue, and we just need to reverse the way we're doing agriculture. We need to just go back, and it's certainly feasible. I mean, people have been taught by the industry that it's not possible, that we can't afford to have the manpower that we would need to grow crops the old-fashioned way, and that is just not true,
Right. No, I mean, actually the WHO has recently come out and said that one of the only ways that we're going to be able to feed the earth and feed the planet is through local agriculture, through small-scale sustainable agriculture.
We need to go back to small-scale agriculture, and it's really sad that the small farms have just been destroyed by this whole process.
Yeah, well, I think that for some reason that recent film Interstellar, did you see that?
No, I haven't.
Well, it said it's the dystopian future, and the only crops that they're growing are the GMO corn. That's the only thing that's growing anymore, and there's just whipping across the earth, and the population is drastically fallen. There's only a small remnant of humanity left, and there's it's the Dust Bowl worldwide. Very, very interesting. And hopefully we're not moving towards a future like that. Hopefully we can avert such a timeline through the choices we make and through what we choose to support with our dollars and where we put our energy. So, Dr. Seneff, thank you so much for coming on. I got a whole list of other questions I would have loved to hit on, but we've already hit an hour.
We'll have to do this again.
Yeah, I'd love to have you on again, and it's just it's been really, really good talking to you. Where can people find more of your stuff, and where can people where can people find you, and where can they contact you if they would like to?
So I have a webpage at MIT, which is people, P-E-O-P-L-E, people.csail, C-S-A-I-L, that's my lab, Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, .mit.edu/ my last name, S-E-N-E-F-F. And if you just do a Google search on my last name, you'll probably find a bunch of material. I've got various video recordings and audio recordings, and I have a lot of papers and things and slideshows at my website you can download. So there's a lot of material you can find pretty easily, I think.
Great. And I would
You
say,
can find email if you want to send me an email. You can find my email address at my webpage.
great. And I would highly suggest that you guys look up. There are a lot of presentations that Dr. Stephanie Seneff has done on YouTube. And look into her work because this is really important. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
I'd love to have you on again in the near future.
Okay, great.